So I want to talk about the familiar essay. So far in class, we've studied several subgenres of literary nonfiction: memoir, the family portrait, place writing, travel writing. This time, we're going to explore the familiar essay. So the familiar essay is, in distinction to the other subgenres that I've just mentioned, tends to be more reflective, contemplative, conversational. The essay that you read for today by Philip Lopat's, The Portrait of My Body, is a classic familiar essay. In the piece, we see Lopat talk about a very large subject, an abstract subject, his body, and he looks at his body from all kinds of different angles. He looks at it in erotic context. He looks at it in so far as how his body relates to his character, so on and so forth. And the style is very conversational. It proceeds in a fairly casual fashion. It's not as if Lopat is necessarily making an argument so much as exploring a particular subject in his own unique, quirky, eccentric voice. The familiar essay really came into being in the 16th century with the great French essayist Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne, in fact, invented the genre, the literary genre of the essay, in his large collection of essais, which is the French word for an attempt, an experiment, a try, a trial. And we see Montaigne write about very broad subjects like books or dying or cannibals. But he immediately makes the very large subject extremely concrete. He gives us his very personal take on that large subject. And this is one reason why I had you, for your short exercise today, take an abstract concept and try to find specific images that would manifest that abstract concept. So Montaigne, in focusing on his eccentricity, his quirks, again in a very casual way, creates this genre. And we see in the 18th century a kind of flowering of the personal essay in the works of writers like Addison and Steele and Johnson. But the true crowning moment of the familiar essay as a genre occurs in the so-called Romantic period, with writers like Charles Lamb and William Hazlitt, and to some extent Leigh Hunt. Lamb created a persona, Elia or Elia. People still don't quite know how he wanted people to pronounce it. A persona, and this persona, who was a little bit like Lamb, but also a little bit not like Lamb, would explore subjects like, well, I don't know, New Year's Eve, or the difficulty of having sympathy for others, or maybe ears. And in these essays, you would see Lamb again go into this very charming, engaging, idiosyncratic meditation on the subject. Hazlitt writes essays on going a journey, or the fight about boxing, or Indian jugglers about Indian jugglers. So, what really goes into a familiar essay? Well, the familiar essay, first and foremost, is an event of intimacy. Think about how you talk to your closest friends in a relaxed atmosphere. Well, that is the kind of voice that you would cultivate in a familiar essay as you meditate on, again, usually a large abstraction that you're going to make concrete. And part of this intimacy is creating a voice that is one of extreme candor, honesty. This person will tell you in the familiar essay pretty much anything. And this, of course, requires a voice that is very vulnerable as well. And along with the vulnerability comes a sense that there's no such thing really as a stable, stiff self, but that an identity is fluid and malleable, and changes. So this emphasis on transience, ephemerality, again, vulnerability, doubt, insecurity, means that the familiar essay can never be self-righteous. The familiar essay is an enemy of dogma. It is not making an argument and marshaling evidence for that argument. Again, it is simply exploring in a thoughtful and often witty way. So wit often plays into the familiar essay, often in the form of irony, often in the form of paradox. Uh, so basically, when you're reading the familiar essay, when you're writing the familiar essay, you really want to slow down and think. All right, what idea really grabs me? What am I really interested in? Am I interested in courage, say? Am I interested in love, say? Now, it seems folly to say, I will now write an essay on love, or I will now write an essay on courage. But this is one of the joys of the familiar essays. It might start with this abstract grandeur, but immediately take the abstract down to the concrete. So there's often something slightly rebellious and cheeky about the familiar essay. It wants to take ideas down off their high horse. It is against pomposity in any form. Ultimately, is it against abstraction in any form? If you're going to write about love in a familiar essay, you would immediately probably talk about one of your own experiences of love that perhaps was unsuccessful or comical. You want to get the reader on your side. You want the reader to pull for you in the familiar essay. You don't want to come across as someone who has mastered something, someone who has achieved a kind of perfection or competence. Let's face it, we don't like people like that most of the time. And in fact, likability is a key part of the familiar essay. The charm of underachieving, the charming underachiever might be a way to describe the mood of the familiar essay. So I would encourage you, if you want to explore this subgenre, to think about an abstract concept that really interests you, but also to think about your own weird spin on that grand idea. Eccentricity, again, is very important in the familiar essay. Weirdness, idiosyncrasy, all the things that make you in a very kind of disarming way. So given all these traits I'm discussing, the familiar essay often, even though it's exploring a so-called positive virtue like courage or love, is ultimately melancholy and ultimately comic. Why do I say that? The familiar essay is ultimately melancholy in a sweet way, ultimately melancholy because it's about our inability to achieve an ideal in this world. This world is messy and mucky and confusing, and we got to wade through that. And we lose what we want to hold hardest to. But that's just part of living life, and we have to come to terms with that. So there is that melancholy that runs through the familiar essay. Well, one reason I had you read the Didion piece today on keeping a notebook is that as you become a serious writer, and I hope that you already are, you will keep a notebook to write down the weirdest thoughts that you have, the strangest thoughts that you have, no matter where they come from. Write them down. Write them down. You won't remember. You think you will, but you won't. A writer is someone who writes things down. So get in the habit of doing that, and your life becomes, in a way, a familiar essay. Insofar as you're constantly meditating on the meaning of your life, but in very concrete and strange circumstances. More recent examples of the familiar essay, by the way, would be ones that we've read, and aside from the Low Pot, I would say that the piece by Church on ecstatic truth would qualify as a familiar essay. The piece by Barden on workshops would be a familiar essay. The piece by Ozick on the essays of Warm Body would be a familiar essay. Famous familiar essayist of the 20th century would, of course, be Virginia Woolf. In the early part of the 20th century, George Orwell, early part of the 20th century. And more recently, some of the people, again, that I've just mentioned, but also Joan Didion would qualify, I think, very much as a familiar essayist in her own right. All right, that's all I have to say about the familiar essay at this time. It's a wonderful subgenre to explore, and I hope that you do.